I'm going to assume that there are some music fans in the audience, right? Okay. So I have a bit of a rant that we're going to go on here, and it should be of interest to anybody who listens to music. And this rant really began when I was in grade 7. This was in Mr. Penner's science class. I couldn't find a picture, but let's just say that this is a reasonable facsimile. And Mr. Penner said something that really stuck with me for a reason I don't know. He said, he was trying to tell us about the 3 states of matter. And he says, a solid is obvious. You know what the shape of a solid is. But a liquid or a gas, they assume the shape of the container in which they're stored. I have no idea why that stuck with me, but it kind of blew my mind in a weird way. And then when I was getting deeper into what's going on with music today, I thought of Mr. Penner again. And I thought, you know what? We can apply those same principles with the 3 states of matter to music. We can talk about containers. Now, this is the first container that we ever stored music in. Up until Thomas Edison came along with his wax cylinder, music was effervescent. It was there and then it wasn't. There was no way to store music for later analysis, later enjoyment, later study. But with this, we began to see music preserved for future generations. Now, before then, a song could be a couple of rhymes that you spouted off in the pub. It could be a folk ballad, which went on for as many verses as it took to tell the story. It could be a symphony, which could go on for an hour or more. The Greek national anthem has 158 verses. Wow. So the music was flexible. It was like a gas in the air. There was no container for it. But with the Edison cylinder, it had a container. And that container could hold 2 minutes worth of music. If you wanted to be a recording artist after 1877, your music had to conform to the size and shape of the container, which meant a 2-minute song. Okay, so for the first time, there is a time limit on music. Then, around 1900, a guy by the name of Emil Berliner came up with the idea of taking some of Edison's principles and applying them to a rotating flat disc. And after a couple of years, everything standardized into a 10-inch disc that ran at 78 RPM with grooves cut so far apart. The math and the geometry tells us that if we use those standards, we can get between 3 and 4 minutes of music before we have an interruption, before we have to get up, change the record, or turn it over. 3 or 4 minutes. That's the size of our container. And for the next 50 years, the 78 RPM record became the thing that standardized our appetite for popular music. We began to crave, expect songs that were 3 or 4 minutes. Now, this is John Philip Sousa. You might remember him as the guy who does all the marching music. And he absolutely hated the idea of recorded music. In fact, he, in 1906, published an essay entitled The Menace of Mechanical Music. And he believed that by committing something to a permanent storage format, like a record or a cylinder, would lead to unrest and social decline. And the reason is because once you put something in this container, it would be in that container in that form forevermore. It ruined the opportunity for a reinterpretation of that music. That performance would be frozen in time. And what would musicians do if they recorded something once? Were they not needed again? He was actually the guy who came up with the phrase canned music for very good reason. So there's your Edison cylinder, and here we go with a can. So if you've ever heard the term canned music, you can talk to John Philip Sousa about it. Most other people really embraced recorded music. This was cool. For the first time ever, I could enjoy music on my own terms. There were others that didn't like it, musicians' unions for once, because, well, if we're not going to be playing live and radio stations and other places are going to be playing pre-recorded music, well, what are we going to do? And record labels didn't like it very much because, well, if we played records on the radio, get it for free, why would anybody go out and buy records? So we had this 10-inch, 78 RPM record for about 50 years. And like I said, it created this standard for how long songs should be. But then in 1948, Columbia Records introduced something they called the 33 1/3 long-playing vinyl record. By making the record bigger, by cutting the grooves closer together, and by slowing down how fast the record turned, down from 78 to 33 1/3, they found that they could get 20 to 22 minutes of music on a side of a record before they had to get up and turn it over. So for the first time ever, we had this really long interval where we could just sit back and listen to music. The container got bigger. And this led to an explosion in interest in longer forms of music. For example, a symphony. You could get a movement of a symphony quite comfortably on one side of an LP. If you were into Broadway show tunes, you could get a lot of music from that show on one side of an LP. And it was marvelous. So we expanded the music to fit the available space on the container. Now, in the 1960s, this got even bigger. Starting in about 1965, artists began to realize that they had this huge palette that they could fill. And we ended up with wonderful albums from the Beatles and Pink Floyd and Mike Oldfield and so many others. They wanted to write to the size of the container. Now, we still maintained our liking for 3 and 4 minute songs. That was perpetuated by the 7-inch single, which was introduced by RCA Records in 1949 as a response to the 12-inch album. And radio really embraced this. It was cheap, it was easy to use, it was easy to distribute. So our demands for 3 and 4 minute songs was kept alive by the single. Now, a single like this could hold up to 5 minutes. Well, actually, it could hold longer than that, but audio quality begins to degrade after 5 minutes. So we didn't put more than 5 minutes worth of music on one of these records. Not very often, anyway. We had other containers in the 1960s. We had the cassette, which was invented by a Dutch company called Philips. We had the 8-track, which was invented by, was it somebody wooed the 8-track? Okay. And then we had reel-to-reel tape. Now, you could buy pre-recorded records, pre-recorded music on all 3 formats, but they, nobody really messed too much with that long capacity of the LP. They didn't fill these containers to the brim. But then comes along the compact disc, 1982 and into early 1983. We stopped talking about a rotating disc that had a spiral that was 500 meters long, and we began talking about a plastic disc that contained megabytes of information. The CD was developed by Philips of the Netherlands and Sony of Japan. And this new design, could hold up to 74 minutes worth of music. Now, why 74 minutes? Well, there's an apocryphal story that says that the president of Sony insisted that the new format hold his favorite symphony uninterrupted, which was Beethoven's Ninth in D minor, Opus 125. It ran, his favorite recording of that performance ran 74 minutes, so he declared CDs have to hold at least 74 minutes. Not true. It's a really good story. But really what it came down to is that Philips wanted the CD to be 10 centimeters in diameter, but Sony wanted it to be 11.5 centimeters in diameter. So they had a compromise, and they made it 12 centimeters in diameter. And if you do the math and all the geometry and you figure out exactly how you place the binary code on the CDs using the standards set out by Sony and by Philips, you get 74 minutes worth of music. It's as boring as is that people began to fill this container to the brim. You had so much more music on a CD than you did on an album. Here's the worst offender. This is the Red Hot Chili Peppers' 1991 album, Blood Sugar Sex Magic. Yeah, you can do that, that's fine. This record has 73 minutes and 55 seconds worth of music on it. So 5 seconds short of the ultimate capacity of the CD. Did it need to have that much music on it? Have you heard this record? Not necessarily. But, again, we filled the available container. Then we get to the internet. On March the 14th of this year, which is also affectionately known as Pi Day, 3.14, right? A guy in New Mexico posted this. He calls it shepherd's pie. And what he did was take pi, the mathematical concept, and extend it to 1 billion digits. Then he taught an artificial intelligence music program to base music on those 1 billion digits. So shepherd's pie, in its entirety, is 999,999 days long. It's 114 years. There's no container. It can be as big as it wants to be. And this brings me to streaming. Here's where the rant is going to begin. Now, don't get me wrong, I love streaming. I think streaming is wonderfully convenient. The idea of having 50 million songs on a device maybe that big, it is just so cool. The entirety of human musical history on this, wherever you are, awesome. However, there have been some changes in our behavior when it comes to accessing and consuming music as a result of streaming. Let's just talk about physical containers again. When you bought a record, CD or vinyl, doesn't matter, you had to work for a certain amount of time before you earned enough money so you could actually go out and buy one of these things, right? And then you would take it home and you would listen to it over and over and over again, even to the songs you didn't like. Because if you made up your mind that you didn't like a song on an album, well, it was kind of like you wasted your money a little bit, right? So you would listen to these songs over and over again until the penny drops and you go, yes, okay, fine, I like it. That's one thing. The other thing was that the record, the container, had additional resources. There was artwork that you could study. There were liner notes. There were lyric sheets. This was all really cool. So you had this financial investment in the container and what was on it, and you had this intellectual investment in the container based on what you could divine from it. Streaming, not so much. It is context-free music that goes in one ear and out the other. There is nobody to tell you why that song is important, what's cool about this band, who is behind this album, where is this scene building, and what is this sound all about? You don't hear any of that. It's in one ear and out the other. I call it organized noise. And again, don't get me wrong, it's here to stay, love it a lot, but for a rich music experience, it's kind of lacking a little bit. The other thing that we need to talk about are some really frightening numbers. There is a company behind Spotify called the Echo Nest, and the Echo Nest is forever parsing data from users. They know exactly how we listen to music, how often we listen to music, and how we skip music. This is really important. I'm going to give you these numbers. If a song comes on and you're listening on Spotify, there is a 24% chance that you will skip that song in the first 5 seconds. There is a 29% chance that you will skip that song in the first 10 seconds. And there is a 35% chance that you will skip that song before 30 seconds have passed. Now, this is a really important concept. No one gets paid for a stream unless it runs for at least 30 seconds. So, producers and composers and songwriters and record labels are throwing everything they can at that first 30 seconds to make sure we, with our short attention spans, hang on to that song for at least 31 seconds. Best example right now, Taylor Swift and Me. Now, when you hear that song again, listen to how it starts. How long is the intro? 0 seconds. When does the chorus come up? Almost right away. How many hooks can you count in that first 30 seconds? A lot. The idea is that this song has been genetically programmed to hold our attention for 30 seconds. That's perverting, changing, altering the way music is being created. Let's go a little bit further. If you look at the Billboard Hot 100 and you go back to 2000, the average length of a hit single was 4 minutes. There were no songs under 2.5 minutes. Today, the average length of a song on the Hot 100 is 3 minutes and 30 seconds, so a decline of 30 seconds. And the number of songs under 2.5 minutes has increased by 8% over just the last 3 years. I'll give you a great example. What's been the number one song for the last 12 weeks? Old Town Road by Lil Nas X. How long is Old Town Road? I'll tell you, 1 minute 57 seconds. The reason these songs are getting shorter is because artists and producers and engineers are looking at the data and they see, oh, okay, a shorter song seems to indicate that people will skip less. There's a greater chance of us getting to that 30 seconds with shorter songs. And with a shorter song, we can have more shorter songs after that on a playlist so that the 30-second mark comes up much more quickly. Now, let's think about this if you're a prog rock band, all right? And you specialize in songs that are 7, 8, 9, 10 minutes long. You are going to get paid exactly the same amount for a 10-minute rock and roll epic than somebody who writes a song that's 2 minutes long. So you might think, as an artist, why bother writing a song that long? I'm not saying you won't do it, but if your album has 5, 10-minute songs on it, you have a chance to score that 30-second mark 5 times. But consider a band like the Pocket Gods. They're from the UK. They understand how things work. Earlier this year, they released an album called 300 by 30. And what that is 298 songs, each less than 45 seconds long. And the idea is, put it on, and that 30-second mark comes up an awful lot. And that's where they make their streaming money. I'll give you another example. There's a band called Wolfpack, very clever. They needed some money, so they released an album that had 10 tracks on it. Each track was 32 seconds long, and each track was dead silent. There was no audio on it whatsoever. So they told their fans, put this on when you go to bed. Put it on repeat. And every time it went past, what happened? They got paid. And they made $20,000 until Spotify called them and said, cut it out. Again, gaming the system. It's all about the container. If the container is nowhere, well, then look what can possibly happen. The last thing I want to talk about is away from streaming and into headphone culture. How many people walk around like a zombie with headphones on, right? You seal yourself off in your little private bubble of music so you don't have to deal with other human beings, right? Okay. This all began 40 years ago this coming Monday. What happened 40 years ago this coming Monday? Anybody know? Sony Walkman was released, the very first Sony Walkman. And again, we go back to the president of Sony Music, and he demanded that the Sony Walkman include 2 headphone jacks because he couldn't imagine people walking around like zombies, sealing themselves off from the rest of the world. That lasted for 1 iteration of the Walkman. They went to the 1 headphone jack. But the thing that made the Sony Walkman cool was okay, the cassette mechanism was small, but for the first time ever, you had lightweight, good-sounding headphones. In the back of the 70s, I had a pair of Koss headphones, and they weighed 6 pounds. That's not an exaggeration. 6 pounds. But the Sony Walkman were really light, and you could wear them anywhere, and they sounded really good. So as time went on, we became addicted to this idea of being able to curate our own little music space. And that has had an undesirable side effect. There's something known as ego casting. And ego casting means you are only predisposed to listening to things or absorbing things that you already agree with. This is part of the problem with the Spotify algorithm, or the algorithm used by any of the other streaming music services. They recommend music that they think you will like based on what you've already listened to. So it doesn't really work that hard into getting you outside of your musical comfort zone. There are times where you need repeated, unintentional exposure to a type of music before the penny drops and you go, oh, okay, I get it. And I'll give you an example. Modern jazz. Nobody likes modern jazz the first time they hear it because it's so complex. The backstories are so deep. The musicianship is just way out there. You need somebody to either take you by the hand and explain what Miles Davis or John Coltrane is doing here, or you need to be exposed to it in an office someplace, played over and over and over again before you go, I get it, this is great, give me more. The other side effect from ego casting is that it's spilled over into all media. So if we can control only the music that we like to hear, it's not a very far step before we start controlling only the news we want to hear. So what a surprise. Fake news is a problem. And that is what I think is an offshoot of walking around like a zombie with your Sony Walkman in 1979. So in conclusion here, what I would like you to do is remember that there's only really one container that matters. This. We have, from what we understand, an infinite database of music in our heads, in our skulls. But there are people who are trying to game us neurologically. So they get prime placement in your container so they can make money, so they can make a career, so they can make music for everybody else. So here is what I'm going to ask you to do, and I want you to take this away and think about it. When you listen to music, try to see if they're manipulating you into sticking around for that 30 seconds. If they are, you can choose to listen to 30 seconds and move on, or not. But I really hope that you can avoid the skip button. Live in the music. Listen carefully. And hopefully, maybe, by giving yourself that extra bit of time with something that may be unfamiliar, that may be different, that your life will be made richer by the music. Beware what they want you to put into this container, because it's the only one that matters. Thank you very much.